Now, talking about recurrent expenditure, it seems that that component was allocated at over 90% of the 4.3 trillion naira in budget estimate. We're still seeing a high level of recurrent expenditure, although the Minister of Finance and the coordinating Minister for the Economy, Dr. Ngozi Kunjuela, has actually stated that there will be a gradual cut in recurrent expenditure. But to what extent do you think we can bridge the gap between the capital and recurrent expenditure?
I do think this is something the government needs to work on. There will be a lot of compromises they need to make. For example, you did mention the percentage of the recurrent expenditure, which I actually think is just about 83% and not 90% of the total budget, and that's also inclusive of the debt service obligations and, of course, statutory transfers. Let me also mention that the impact of the debt level that we have currently now is also very significant for the budget, especially that in 2015 we will be using about 22% of the total budget to actually service our debts, particularly in terms of interest payment and, of course, some principal redemptions that would have to be made in 2015. And I think it's very important to also watch the fact that the debts, the borrowings, the rate of borrowing of the government, the public sector borrowing, have actually to some extent crowded out private sector borrowing in the market, especially when you look at the yield environment currently.
That is locally.
Exactly. When you begin to look at the yield environment around the 16% levels for the sovereign notes, that to a very large extent indicate a very, very high interest rate for the corporate, which of course is not good in a country where we actually need to develop the SME space. Interestingly, again, you would actually notice the fact that the level of borrowings that have been made over the past few years have actually been relatively in line with the capital expenditure, meaning that virtually all the revenues that have been generated by the government have actually gone into service and recurrent expenditure, which is why it's very, very challenging for the government at this point in time to actually reduce recurrent expenditure, especially when you consider the rigidity of the recurrent expenditure in the country. I think it's something that the government needs to do. They need to rationalize the government agencies, parastatals, and of course bring in more discipline in terms of cost efficiency around government spending with respect to recurrent expenditure. I do note that one of the major reasons for the significant increase in recurrent expenditure has been the salary increases of workers, but I do think that there are so many things the government needs to do with respect to reining in this rise in recurrent expenditure, which of course you would actually notice that recurrent expenditure for 2015 is even a little higher than what we had in 2014, despite the decline in the revenue projections. And that tells us the nature of the recurrent expenditure in Nigeria, which of course we really can't continue, because if you continue to borrow in the economy to fund your capital expenditure, and even in some instances even fund some of your own recurrent expenditure, it's just like you're having an household borrowing to even feed. So it's a very big challenge. There's really nothing wrong in borrowing. However, when you borrow, you must be sure that you're actually borrowing for capital expenditure project that would actually lead to increased revenue generations for the government, and of course improve the overall development of the country, and of course the welfare and standard of living of the people in Nigeria. So I do think the government needs to rationalize the government. If you do look at examples of China and even recently Kenya, which is an African country, when the new president came in, one of the things that the president did in Kenya was to actually rationalize the government parastatals and bring down the level of government spending as has to do with recurrent expenditure significantly. China, for example, today has one of the most lean government structure in terms of the number of ministries, for example, in terms of the number of parastatals, and of course some duplications that you see around government functions have actually been matched together so as to bring in more efficiency, not only in terms of cost, but also in terms of the operations of the government, which is one of the things I think the government needs to work on in Nigeria. Some committees have been set up in the past, but I think what the government needs to do is to go back to those reports. I don't think we actually have a challenge in identifying them. I think some committees have identified some of those duplications in terms of government functions in the past, and what the government needs to do is just to take proper steps in terms of implementing some of those recommendations of those committees.
Now, I'm just wondering, how do you think that the government can balance the fact that it's borrowing locally, like you said, outcrowding the corporate companies, the corporate institutions in the country? And if we tie that to the fact that the revenues have been dwindling, and of course it intends to pay back based on how much it generates, how do you think it's going to achieve a balance in this situation?
That's what I mentioned with respect to the percentage of the budget that actually goes into debt service. You would actually note that the debt to GDP ratio now is still very decent at about 13%. And of course, the fiscal deficit is just about 0.8% at the moment. However, those figures, as good as they are, you need to consider them in the perspective of the percentage of your budgetary revenues that would be going into servicing those debt obligations that you've accumulated over the past 7 years, in particular, when we've seen significant growth in terms of the rate of government debt stock. So I do think what the government needs to do at this point in time, yes, you need to deliver on your obligations. The government needs to service those obligations because they carry the full faith and credit of the government, and you don't want a situation whereby the government begins to default on these obligations. I think what the government needs to do is to look inward in terms of increasing its revenue base, which is one of the things they're actually trying to do now. You would actually notice that the 2015 budget, or let me say appropriation bill, because it's not been signed into a budget, you'd actually notice that one of the things the government has done is to also increase the non-oil revenue so as to reduce dependence on oil and, of course, the volatility that brings into government fiscal flexibility. And I think one important thing at this point is the fact that for the first time in Nigeria in the past 20 years, we've actually seen a situation where non-oil revenue is projected to actually contribute about 45% of the total revenue projections. I do think this is ambitious, but I think the government may actually work towards achieving that, even though I think it's going to be very challenging for the corporates and, of course, the Nigerian people. I do expect that there would also be some implementations around the luxury tax that have actually been proposed, which, of course, in a typical situation like this, what you typically want to do is to also bring in some luxury tax. However, it's not so important to propose this luxury tax, for example, the taxation on private jet acquisitions, the taxation on yacht acquisitions, and of course some about 1% tax on residential properties in Abuja, that is over 300 million naira. These are very important things to do, particularly in a country where we have significant inequality in terms of income levels. The top 5, for instance, account for more than 50% of the total wealth of the country. So in a situation like this, what you need to do is to tax the rich more so as to bring some level of redistribution of income. So you tax them, and of course you spend such money on welfare and developmental projects that would benefit the mass of the country. So I think the implementation is very important. Not so much of the revenue that we may generate from that in the initial days, but I think the government needs to look more into that. I think in addition to that, after elections, I do think that in 2016 we may actually see, or even before then, maybe an increase in the VAT. Not only because the government needs to generate revenue from this. Of course, this would also assist the state government, and I do expect that some of the state government may actually mount pressure on the federal government to increase the value-added tax from 5% that we currently have now to about 10%. And of course, that may actually lead to not less than about 600 billion naira increase in terms of revenue. And of course, 85% of this actually goes to the state and the local government. The federal government only takes 15% of the VAT that is generated in the state. So I do think this is some of the things that the government may want to do in the future, especially when you compare the VAT in Nigeria to other neighboring countries like Ghana, for example. VAT is about 15%. So I think these are some of the painful decisions that we may have to take going forward.
Painful measures. The Minister of Finance has actually told us to tighten our belts a little bit more and be prepared for what will come in the course of the year. I would like you to hold your breath for a minute. Abiola Razak is the head of research and strategy at the Associated Discount Health, and we have been taking a look at the 2015 appropriation bill. The latest development around that bill is that the Senate has approved the $52 benchmark, crude benchmark for that budget, but we do not know when the entire bill will be passed. We'll be right back.